a small announcement regarding the agenda. Our panelist, Ms. Anki Das from Facebook, has not been able to join us, unfortunately. So we have with us the moderators and the panelists. And may I please request the moderator, Dr. Rajat Kathuria, to initiate the discussion and introduce the panelists as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Gangesh, and welcome back to the first session after the inaugural. So we've got a wonderful cast of speakers, and I'm really not going to introduce them because they're all well known, and their profiles will be in the folder that has been provided to you. So we've got Ambassador Mukerji, we've got Sanjeev Bikchandani, and we've got Rajan Mathews. And all of them, and as Gangesh said, Anki is unable to make it. So this remains an all-male panel. Something that we've been in recent times reluctant to do, but we tried our best. So I think the first session excellently set out the tone for the sessions to follow. And what I'm going to do in this session is I'm not going to speak too much, and let each of them each of the speakers make their opening remarks, and then I'll open it up to the floor. From their own perspective, Ambassador Mukerji will talk about, let's say, the international context to data flows. Sanjeev will talk about the jobs and AI challenge, among others. And Rajan will talk about the landscape of the digital economy in India and what he sees as the future and the challenges that India faces in leveraging what Aruna Sundararajan was talking about, harnessing and leveraging the data economy for India. So without taking too much time, may I begin with the sort of international context and invite Ambassador Mukerji for his remarks. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Rajat, and good morning to all of you. I was very happy to see that we were in a panel with also Anki Das, but then we don't have Anki Das, so that's one of the issues in the international context, is how to bridge the digital divide as far as genders are concerned. So perhaps you can pass it on to Anki that she sort of illustrated one of the missing links. But on international cooperation on the digital economy, I thought I would just make some 6 points on very broad points. The first is that today, globally, those of us who follow strategic affairs are aware that there's a tremendous polarization taking place globally. There's a revival in one sense of a Cold War across the Atlantic, US, Russia, then there's the emergence of China and so on. Now all that has an impact also on the digital world. And there is therefore a fear that the principle of international cooperation, which Secretary Aruna Sundararajan so eloquently spoke of earlier today, is probably threatened by this polarization. So this is something that is important for all of us in this room who want to take this whole digital movement forward, that we are going to confront polarization in a political sense globally, and probably also in a technological sense. In terms of the international landscape, ever since 1998, when this issue was put onto the United Nations General Assembly and the first resolutions were adopted on a global perspective on an emerging digital economy, 2 things have happened. One, which has happened in a very focused way, is on the securitization of the digital economy. And that has been done by a group of governmental experts nominated by the UN Secretary General, and there's no surprise in the nominations. He has always nominated the 5 permanent members. Some of them may not be as active as India has been, but they've always been there in that group. India's been in that group except for a short period between 2013 and 2015. So this is a group of governmental experts who came up in 2015 with a set of 11 norms to secure cyberspace, including critical national infrastructure, including the role, responsibilities of states on preventing malicious attacks and so on, which is all available on the internet. But the bad news about this work was linked with this polarization that I spoke of right at the beginning, that in 2015 and 2016, especially because of a divergence of views between China on the one hand, supported by Russia, and the United States on the other hand. There has been no agreement on how to take these 11 norms forward to implement them in actual practice in a global context. And that throws up its own issues. Now, one of the issues on which the divergence has taken place is how do you respond to threats to the global digital infrastructure and the digital economy. And the response and the discussions in that governmental group of experts focused on the need, on the availability of a provision in the UN Charter saying that if there's an attack on any one country in terms of the digital space, then under Article 51 of the UN Charter, that country has the right of self-defense and can retaliate. Now that was the proposition. But that Article 51 is from 1945. It doesn't take into account the year 2019. It doesn't take into account the fact that there are different countries which are now active on the digital landscape, which were not even considered in 1945. And I mention this because the core of Article 51 is that any decision to regularize the self-defense that you take has to be taken by the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. So again, it goes back to that same issue of until you reform that Security Council, you are not really going to be able to see it able to implement its decisions. So that's where the securitization discussion internationally has got stuck. And in India, as a consequence of that, we had a multi-stakeholder group set up in the National Security Council here, and we formulated norms for India. And these are right now with the government, and let us see where they go to. But the forms that we nominated went into the second area, which the international effort has not really focused on as much, although they've talked about it, which is how do you create a supportive structure for the use of cyber technologies for development? And this was an issue which was also highlighted in 1998. In fact, in 2002, the United Nations General Assembly did specify that although we will move on issues of security of cyberspace, we should not lose sight of the fact that cyberspace exists for human progress and development. And the UN itself then came out with this very ambitious agenda called the Tunis Agenda in 2005. And then reviewed the Tunis Agenda in 2015, merged it with the Agenda on Sustainable Development, and there's a whole lot of issues out there. But the short point is there are no norms, there are no specific actions being taken to provide a supportive structure for this part of the digital and cyber landscape. And then there's the third movement, a third process which was not very visible about 4 years ago, but today has got a tremendous traction, and that was also referred to by the Secretary in her remarks, and that is the entire area of electronic commerce. Now here in India, for a long time, we pretended that electronic commerce did not exist. But I'm glad that finally there is a consultation paper available on the net on a draft electronic commerce policy. But as with most of these things, whether they are norms for security, whether they are norms or support policies for development, including economic development, and whether they are trade-related electronic commerce norms, the short point of all these three is that they will all have to respond to one characteristic of the digital economy, which is technology. So this is something that we speak about something, we bring together an approach or a policy, and then find that technology either renders that policy obsolete or requires that policy to be tweaked so much that the policy itself has to go back to the drawing board. And this is where the broad picture is as far as international activities on the global global cyberspace is concerned. But I'd like to end this part of what I wanted to talk about by a reference to something else that should concern us in India. And that is something that is happening in our own continent. We have all been talking about the Belt and Road Initiative, and we've been discussing the various connectivity options of, how do we offer alternatives to the Belt and Road, and we have this Asia-Africa growth corridor between Japan, India, and Africa, or we have the Chabahar Iranian initiative with Central Asia and Afghanistan and so on. But there is, in the digital world, another initiative that I think we need to think about and talk about and see the opportunities for India, and that is the Digital Silk Road Initiative. This is something that is very much now being pushed by China. They will build the infrastructure, but I think that we need to have an open mind on how participation in the Digital Silk Road can combine the infrastructure of which is built by China with the content which may come out of a country like India, and provide some kind of opportunity and synergy for creating what I like to call the Asian century. I mean, this is be the real kind of symbolic thing about the Asian century. Now, where does India stand on these global issues and negotiations? We are part of the global discussions on the security of the global cyberspace. But as I said, because of the deadlock between the permanent members of the Security Council, we are not able to make any headway until that is reformed, until India becomes as relevant as these 5 countries are in the global security discussions. I do not see India making any big difference in terms of making its own contribution. On the other hand, on the second area of a supportive structure for the use of cyber technologies for development and for the economy and for privacy and all these other issues which the Secretary referred to in her remarks, I think India has a real leadership role to play. And I think that this is something that maybe should be a part of our discussions, so that we can push this forward based on our own experiences that we are going through right now. I think that on electronic commerce, India should really do much more than just create a protectionist, the default setting of India is always that we need to protect ourselves. But I think in this, we need to be proactive and see the opportunities for ourselves. One of the things that I would like to see is to offset something we did in when we entered into the Information Technology Agreement in 1998 and at that time, and which is blamed by many of our manufacturers today for not generating supportive system in India for the growth of manufacturing, is if we enter into electronic commerce negotiations, then is it possible to review some of the things that we gave up when we entered the ITA agreement? This is something that is probably worth looking at, and it could happen, if not politically, then at least technically, because there's so far not much work being done on the classification of electronic commerce, whether it's goods or services. This is an area which is there, which needs to be developed much more. And the last thing that I'd like to talk about is that we are all aware that the digital economy in India is dependent on the wider digital economy. There are reasons for it. The most well-known reasons are, for example, the infrastructure. Our data is transferred through fiber optic cables. There are just these 2 huge cables which link India to Europe basically, and then to the wider world. How do you we don't have any stake in operating these cables. Even in terms of security, the cables are monitored by some other countries and organizations rather than our own, and so on and so forth. So this is one part of it. The second part of it is issues like cybercrime. For many years, people have talked about Budapest Convention on Cybercrime, how India should be part of the Budapest Convention on Cybercrime. And in a very Indian way, we adopted a lot of the Budapest Convention into the amendment of our IT Act in 2009. So we have our own Budapest provisions in harmony with Budapest, and so on. But if you look at the domain as a global commons, then I think that at least India cannot, because we are so dependent on others for the progress and the dynamism of this domain and for what we get out of this domain, then India cannot afford to let the domain exist in the state of not chaos, but in the state of unregulation, if I may use that word, as it is now. It requires, this domain, the cyber domain, requires a similar effort that was made from 1967 onwards for the maritime domain. We need to have a structure, a framework in place which will regulate this domain globally. And that is an enterprise which we need to start with a discussion. If we don't discuss what are the needs of this domain, then we will never get to the end, which is what the maritime domain got in the form of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. I would like, in my lifetime, to see a United Nations Convention on cyberspace, for example, which will bring in cyber security, cyber crimes, development in cyberspace, human rights, privacy laws, and dispute settlement. I mean, there are these structures which a person like me can always push forward, but we need to populate those structures with discussions, with ideas which will come out from a discussion. And I think that that's what I'd like to really end with. Thank you, Rajat.
Thank you, Ambassador Mukerji. I think really interesting and insightful remarks on the role that India can play. And I think we'll come back to this because often, not only in the trade domain, but also in international negotiations, India is often sort of accused of trying to stall negotiations. And if that's the case, then it's difficult to sort of take on a leadership role or a leadership mantle. And I think it's time, given our stage of development, we begin to try and do that. And I think one of the things that struck me about the Secretary's remarks was the need to build domestic capacity, not only sort of obviously in this domain, but also elsewhere as well, to be able to play that leadership role. May I now invite Sanjeev for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Rajat. Thank you, Ambassador Mukerji, for your wonderful opening remarks. So I've got probably 50 bullet points down, but Rajat has asked me to focus on AI, jobs, automation, and because we run Naukri, so I'm supposed to be an expert, although I'm not, right? No, but I just want to make a couple of basic points. That in 1985, I was in my first job, fresh out of college, and the Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi was talking about introducing computers in banks and computers in government offices, and there was massive resistance from the unions and the staff, saying there will be massive unemployment and staff will be redundant. If you look at headcount in government and banks from 1985 to now, I suspect there's been substantial growth, although I don't have the numbers, right? So point I'm making is, look, when new technology comes, when it may look like it's threatening, and maybe in some cases, maybe some jobs may be displaced, but by and large, new technology very often presents new opportunities for growth as well. So the entire Indian IT industry, which now is I think $240 billion, okay, came out of the personal computer. Okay, well, not just personal computer, but even minis and mainframes. But and Kiran is sitting here. Kiran knows better than me. What happened, right? And millions of people are working there. It built brand India. It's earning foreign exchange for India, and so on, right? Now, the fundamental point I'm making is that society adapts, companies and organizations adapt when a new technology emerges. New industries are born. Okay. Now, will automation and AI displace people? So look, the way displacement happens when a model changes is usually people don't lose jobs. It's just that the old method of working does not grow in employment in the same manner. But typically in India, a lot of people don't get sacked. Okay, it does happen, but it's rare. But so if you look at the Indian IT industry today, I think post the global financial crisis, and then the business model of the IT industry has changed globally with digitization and products and platforms, and less of new business coming in the form of pure services, right? What has happened? Now we service the IT industry from Naukri. We help them find people. The rate of growth of employment, as per the old model of functioning, has slowed down. No two ways about it. But it's not as if people are getting sacked. Fresh people are not being hired for those activities, but there are other opportunities emerging. So companies and organizations have adapted to service their clients, to serve their clients in the new models. They're digitizing, they're getting into platforms, they're getting into products, and it's happening. And the industry will take some time to transition, but when it does transition substantially, it will be once again, a very robust industry, and it already is actually, right? We invest in startups from our company, and we've invested about a substantial sum of money over the last 10 years into various different startups. So one of these startups, for example, is a young company out of Indore. Now, Indore is not the most likely place where you find a tech startup. But the digitization, the digital economy is throwing up entrepreneurs everywhere, right? So there are these three young gentlemen. They all three studied agricultural engineering in IIT Kharagpur. All three went to IIM Ahmedabad and graduated in the agricultural management program, right? And then they said, let's do an agri startup, right? Now, what is the agri startup they're doing? They're sitting out of Indore because one of those three is from Indore. And they're servicing farmers in 6 districts around Indore. And what have they started? They started with a call center that call up and get advice on diseases, on pesticides, insecticides, agricultural inputs, free of cost. And they popularized that phone number, and farmers began to call up. It moved on to WhatsApp, and they said, hey, send us a photograph of the diseased plant or leaf. Now, they have built an expert system. They've got an expert back office to address all this. Now, for farmers, they didn't have access to experts locally. They would go to the traditional offline retail channel where they would purchase inputs from. And very often, they were oversold or missold. They needed 2 things, they were sold 6 things. But sometimes the products were counterfeit, right? Now they're getting authentic advice. It is impacting the productivity. An expert system is being built. Now it's being digitized that, okay, this farmer in this district, in this geographical location with the coordinates has got this much land, this is the nature of the soil, this is what he grows, this is our cropping patterns. It's all being recorded. Now, this is an example where you're using automation, you're going to get into AI, you're doing analytics in the future. Hopefully you'll expand, and hopefully it'll impact agricultural productivity for those farmers, right? This is one small example of digitization that is helping the old economy do better. It is not taking away jobs. It may take away some jobs in some traditional distribution channels for products, because now they can't mis-sell or oversell. But I think that's okay, right? Good stuff is being done. Likewise, we've invested in a small company in Kota. Now, again, Kota is not a place where you'll expect a startup. Now, these people are working in 2 districts around Kota. And they're digitizing the pharmacies in the villages to do teleconsulting with doctors in Kota for repeat consultations, right? And the patients who come there are able to talk to doctors and figure out how to move ahead after the first consultation was in person. And the pharmacy makes money by selling them the drugs, the medicines. So it's win-win-win. The patients don't have to spend a day going to the city. They can do it in 1 hour. The pharmacies are happy, the doctors are happy because they're getting some money, they're getting some consultation fees. Again, you are making healthcare more accessible to people in rural India through digitization, through digital economy. And these are not global platforms. These are not that are coming into India, right? These are indigenously developed solutions by local people who are, okay, so another company you invested in called Shop Kirana. Now, Shop Kirana is a company which says, hey, there's all this e-commerce happening, there's all this organized retail happening, there's a threat of disruption, and the little guy, the little shopkeeper is going to possibly be out of business. Can we find a solution that helps the little guy compete better? So in Indore, again, this is the second company out of Indore, that we invested in. They took 1,000 very small Kirana stores in a small geographical area, so density was high. And they said, just tell us the products that you need, and we'll deliver it next day. Maybe same day, maybe next day, right? So just-in-time servicing of the little guy is not serviced. He has to go to the wholesaler to buy, okay? And they've got an app. It's on an app, right? You select the product, the whole catalog is there, and they deliver. And they source from the distributors, wholesalers, sometimes from companies. Now, this intensive distribution was not going to be possible without digitization, without automation, without a mobile phone, a smartphone, and app, right? And they have demonstrated positive unit economics in the pilot that they did, and now they're expanding to 12 cities all over India in the next 6 months, right? So all I'm saying is that we don't have to be afraid of automation. We don't have to be afraid of digitalization. We don't have to be afraid of AI, machine learning, analytics. These are all tools to be used, hopefully for a better, brighter future. Yes, some ways of working will change. But I don't think there'll be large-scale loss of jobs. There'll be creation of new industries, new jobs, new opportunities. I'll stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sanjeev. I think those are extremely important points. And, you know, academic research in labor markets in India started off with the point that Sanjeev made, is that, you know, how much, and Aruna Sundararajan was also referring to this, you know, 70% of jobs could be vulnerable as a result of AI and technology. But over time, I think even the academics recognize that it wasn't the jobs that were vulnerable, it was only certain tasks that could be replaced by automation. And that's the route even academic research now has taken, and ICRIER is doing some of that. So I think these points reinforce the fact that...
So Rajat, this is actually Schumpeter at work.
Yeah, exactly. So this sort of demonstrates that the size of the pie as a result of AI, more efficient markets, the size of pie goes up, and you know, you can have distributional gains as well, depending on how those distributional gains are sort of made available to people who potentially would be losing out. But I think those are important points that we will consider and come back to maybe in the discussions. Let me now invite Rajan for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Rajat. And I'm going to be speaking principally from the perspective of mobile operators. So this is the boundary conditions under which I'm going to address my comments. So you go back to 1994 when the government of India decided that they were going to quote-unquote liberalize things, and we happened to be the first sector that the government decided to liberalize. So we were those folks who felt the full benefit of the focus of the government in terms of the liberalization effort. So when you go back and look at what has transpired in the last 20 plus years, we have to ask ourselves, what is this digitization about? We throw about and bandy this word digitization. Obviously, it comes down to the fact that everything can be reduced to binary bits and bytes, right? So what we're seeing is what we call, convergence on steroids as more and more industries begin to understand how their processes and transactions and activity can be digitized or can be reduced to binary bits and bytes. And so therefore, once it's reduced to binary bits and bytes, it can be put through on some network, all right? So networks become foundational, be it a data network or originally starting off as a voice network, obviously converged into today's environment. So when does all of this happen on our mobile networks? So first of all, in the context of the liberalization effort, the government realized that landline infrastructure was not going anywhere. All right. When we started the liberalization project, the landline penetration was about 6+ percentage points of the total population. And then you had to wait 7+ years to be able to get, quote unquote, a landline connectivity. The government realized that this was going to get in the way of development. So very clearly, the government's perspective from the very earlier point was this whole notion that the innovations that were to come through communications, that recognition that it had to sustain development. So there was very clearly this focus. Now, when does digitization come into our networks, the mobility network? So first of all, there was this very clear perspective that, yes, the intention was for the landline as well as for the mobile networks to develop in tandem. But actually what happened was, because of the dynamics on the ground, the landline telephony networks went nowhere and the mobility networks took off. And the mobility networks took off because the government of India decided that we were going to use GSM technology, which was a digital technology. And that's how digitization got into our networks. This obviously happened in the US and Europe. Europe when GSM, America had what called DAMs, which was TDMA, subsequently having CDMA, wideband CDMA, obviously again converging in the GSM standards. So for the first 20 plus years of the development of the mobile networks, the thing that propelled the digitization of our networks was that we were able to integrate into the international scheme of things, right? If we had not adopted GSMA technology, all right, the scale, the affordability, the ubiquitousness of handsets, the price points of handsets, and the price points of equipment in our networks would never have happened. So I think we have to take a lesson in terms of saying internationalization and being able to integrate into the international economy is absolutely critical and key, especially in terms of networks which have to interoperate. So again, as they say, history tells us then what happened is what we would call the telecom revolution. We went from a penetration of about 6 to 7% till about 2015. We were almost, again, I'm not talking about households, I'm talking about connections now. There's a difference. But if you just take connections, we were penetrated at about over 95% of the population. In terms of coverage, by the time 4G came into the play, that is principally around about 2014, 2016, 85% of the country already had access to quote-unquote digital telephony, all right? Not the way we experience it today, but digital telephony was available, principally delivering voice and some data, which was what? Email, SMS, messaging, all right? But please understand that because it was a digital network, it began to become quote-unquote, it was data compliant, it was data ready, and the question was, what additional stuff could you put on our networks? The significant impetus in terms of what happens to our networks was the integration with the internet, right? Once you had the internet exploding, our networks began to become what we call IP-fied. We realized that without the integration of our networks, which is predominantly voice, in terms of predominantly data network, which was an IP network, all right, things were going to lag. So that was the next big event that happened in terms of our networks, where we began to what we call IP-fy our networks. And that had tremendous cost savings for our networks as we began to take our core networks, began to IP-fy them. You know, standards became, again, a critical aspect of it. Equipment prices began to come down. We started becoming more data integrated, and more data started flowing into our networks. So fast forward then to 2016, when we had what is called the big disruption that comes in with Jio entering the marketplace. Till then, please understand that the government of India had mandated that your spectrum could only be used for 2G. 2010, 2011 is when the first time the government introduced auction or spectrum that could be used for 3G and 4G, all right? So all of a sudden you had this issue of the legacy versus the new. New operator comes in on an all 4G data network, all right? That is, you know, data obviously sustaining voice telephony. And what we call VoLTE becomes the dominant means by which now voice is transmitted over our networks. One of the things that I want to address very clearly is that lots of people say, you know, oh, the telephony networks were not innovative, didn't do all of this stuff in terms of keeping up with technology. We missed certain things, but let me tell you, if our networks hadn't kept up in terms of technology standards, integration with international protocols, you're right, we would never have experienced where we are today. So the innovations that were going on globally were becoming integrated into our networks in terms of sustaining digital presence and digital, state-of-the-art in terms of our networks. 2016, Jio comes in, as I said, we go to a 4G network. So one of the benefits, or more than one of the benefits, that have come as a result of this is that now there is no more debate in India as to whether we will continue with 2G, 3G. It's game over for those technologies. Very clearly, those data technologies, digitized technologies are history. We are in the 4G world. all of our operators are now focusing on implementing 4G wall-to-wall. That's the impetus. All right? The second thing that has happened is that as a result of this, there's been tremendous consolidation. All right? Because of the price points that were adopted, we had at one point 13 operators. All right? We're down to 3 plus 1 PSU. All right? And obviously the price points have come down. Previously, we used to have voice charging. Voice was now free, offered on a VoLTE network, a digital network. Then what happened with data services, we were paying about 400 plus rupees per gigabit. It came down today, you're paying almost 10 or less rupees per gigabit. There's a recent report that came out which showed India had, by and away, the lowest data prices per gigabit. All right, so again, this is where we are, where we today consume more data in total than China and the US combined. All right, where are we? So we thought that digitization, going into a VoLTE network, and you gave away voice, what was going to happen to voice? We went from consuming 360 to 380 minutes per consumer in 2016, right, before we went to VoLTE, to today, we consume 800 minutes of voice. All right, so just what happened? We've just about doubled the consumption of voice, all right, from about 360, 380 to 800 minutes per user. No revenue coming principally from this. What has happened to data? We went from consuming half a gigabit per consumer to now consuming almost 9 gigabits per user per month. Look at what has happened in terms of the load factor on our networks. All right? This explosion in terms of the consumers because of various dynamics, competition, price points, 4G rolling out. So what has happened in terms of the state of our networks? A tremendous explosion in terms of accessibility, usability, affordability, sustainable development, the explosion of access to the internet, all of this happening, all right? But what transpires is that the revenue stream of the operators started declining precipitously. Now, this is not something that is what we call sustainable. So again, when you look at the future, yes, we've come into 4G, great. Affordability, just about anybody can afford it. All right, you look at the handset prices, which were a major block, has now come down to almost free. All right, you pay 1,500 rupees and you get your money back after 3 years, so it's almost free. Data, $10 per gigabit. All right, almost ubiquitous in terms of availability. All right, where are we in terms of connectivity to the internet? If you, depending upon economics and metrics, the big headlines, right? Depending on how you do the counting, there's about 600 million folks who are connected to the internet. Do they all enjoy 2 megabits of speed? No. All right, so this is where the counting gets a little, fuzzy here. All right, we started off with defining, broadband as 512 kbps. We moved over to 2 Mbps. Today, any broadband connectivity is at 2 Mbps, right? So where's the future? We're saying is that we want to connect all of our citizens, all 1.1 billion of the addressable market. We want to connect all of our 500,000 gram panchayats, our villages, all right? And we want to make sure that they have 2 Mbps worth of speeds and 20 gigabits worth of broadband connectivity in terms of quantum, all right? So that's the policy, and that's where we're going. So here's the challenge that we face, all right? Tremendous explosion in terms of demand, tremendous load factors on our networks, our revenue is going down, and we are caught in a financial crunch. Now, there's no surprise. All right? Debt, one of the things is what we call a bit of a misguided policy. And what is that misguided policy? The Supreme Court of India came back in 2012 and said all spectrum had to be auctioned. Fine. Because of the shortage in terms of the quantum of spectrum put up, prices went through the roof, right? Economics 101, that'll tell you this, right? No big surprise. Debt as a component of total, component of the balance sheet started burgeoning. Who was holding the majority of the debt? The government of India. Why? Because obviously they gave us some preferences in terms of financing the debt. Debt started exploding, and the conundrum that the operators felt was that previously when you had a revenue share regime, which was a pay-as-you-go, where you didn't pay for your spectrum upfront. We went into a regime where you not only paid tremendous amounts of money upfront for your spectrum, but you also got continuation of the legacy system where you continued to pay for as you went in terms of revenue. 30% of every rupee of revenue that comes in to the operator goes back to the government in terms of revenue. This is why we go back and saying, this is a matter that has to be fixed by the government. All right, this is a policy issue. You can't continue to remove tremendous amounts of resources from the industry by way of upfront payments, increase your debt load, increase debt servicing costs, and then continue to extract 30+% from your revenue stream is not sustainable. That's why we keep going back to the government and saying, listen, this has got to be fixed. So the future is bright. Yeah, future is bright. We're going to 4G. We're going to 5G. The government is positioned well. We're already looking at various interoperability issues. We're looking at standards. We're looking at test cases, the whole 9 yards. We're looking at spectrum that is internationally harmonized. All the right things, no question. 5G, we're there, and I think we will not be lagging predominantly in terms of the rest of the world when 5G happens in terms of use cases and adoption in India. So that's the good news. So therefore, what will we enjoy? Our consumers, our businesses will be able to enjoy IoT, machine to machine, cloud computing. All of this stuff will be available. So I don't think there'll be a major lag in terms of our operators being able to provide this country and its citizens and its enterprise with the networks that are by and large fit for use. What's the challenges? Challenge, as I said, one, you've got to fix the debt issue of the industry. You've got to fix the financial issues of the industry. That's one. Secondly, you've got to fix how we price spectrum. And what do I mean by this? Today, on average, for the amount of volumes we sustain, the average operator has about 45 megahertz of spectrum. When you go to 5G, all right, you will require 100 megahertz of spectrum per user. All right, so already we are saying, if you then see, you can see the sensitivity in terms of pricing. If you look at the TRAI recommendation most recently, they said that the 5G spectrum that is going to be put up, which is the 3.2 to 3.6 gigahertz spectrum, if you look at that, it's priced at 492 crore rupees per megahertz. If you multiply that on a pan-India basis, it's close to $1 billion for this 100 megahertz of spectrum globally, or for India. Not sustainable. Not sustainable. The rest of the world is almost giving away the spectrum for free. You look at the US, you look at Europe, nominal pricing of spectrum in order to be able to support and encourage 5G. This has got to happen in India. We've got to find out a new paradigm of being able to price our spectrum so that it gets into the hands of operators who are willing to make the investments necessary to go forward. Absolutely essential. Policy. Not only do we have to fix the financial issue, data privacy is critical. We have the recommendations for an act, but it hasn't happened. So we have to address this. And so I understand that in the interest of time, I'll just mention a few more things that we have to focus on. IPR. If you are going to monetize the value of data, you've got to address IPR. If you're going to address IPR, we've got to get involved in standards. We have not played very well in international standards. We have to look at ways that we embed ourselves effectively in the standards process. We've talked about skilling. I won't say more. This is absolutely essential if we are going to make ourselves successful in this particular space. And finally, we have to basically say, how do we ensure that all the moving parts work together effectively? One of the things that we found, as far as history is concerned, that partnerships are essential. Industry, technology, government, and all of the ecosystem parts, OEMs, have to play together in order to make this success going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Rajan. I'm sure the government will listen and is listening. So, we have we started a bit late, so we'll take the session a little longer, maybe another 10, 15 minutes at most, because we have to come back after lunch for a special address. But I really want, all of you to engage with the speakers, so I'm going to throw it open. And please ask questions, identify the speaker. But may I request you to be brief and to the point? Yeah. Yes, please. Yes, please. Yeah.
I'm Dinesh Sharma, I'm a journalist. My question is to you. One very important segment of the discourse is missing today. That is the impact of digital technology on the legacy media, especially the print media. And one of the problems of the digital platform is that it has become a vehicle for fake news, for which Mr. Trump has been abusing the entire gamut of media. So I would like that if some light can be thrown on the impact of digital media, digital platforms on the legacy media. So that will help.
Okay. Other questions, please? Yes.
Hi, my name is Yogesh, and my question goes to both Ashok and Sanjeev. Rajan made a very relevant point that if you look at the ARPU, the market has been created by the telcos. Their ARPU has actually gone down. And if you see in the last 2 years, the eyeballs have created large digital over-the-top players like Facebook, Google, to have a revenue of 18,000 crores. Now, the revenue has gone up from 5,000 crores in 2 years to 18,000 crores, but the mobile operators don't have any amount or any play in that, though they've created this market. So if you could share what's the perspective globally on net neutrality, because the OTT guys were ready to share their revenue for the operators. And Sanjeev, what is your perspective from the local industry, the apps and the ecosystem on net neutrality?
So my view, sorry.
Collect maybe one more question and then come back to the, yes, please.
My question is to Mr. Mathews. Whether government of India is going to allow Chinese telecom equipment companies like Huawei and GT on security threat ground. Is the risk higher in case of Chinese telecom equipment? What do you think? Or is more about propaganda rather than reality? Because Chinese equipments are supposed to be cheaper, is my view.
Right. Okay. Thank you. So we've had 3 questions. So I'll come back to the panelists. Sanjeev, why don't you pick any of them?
Yeah, so I'll take the net neutrality question. So our view is clear, and I don't want to get into a long debate with Rajan on this, but he's a friend. But we stand for net neutrality. Data, the price of data access, according to us, has already been paid by the consumer to the telecom company. Now, where the consumer chooses to go, he can go anywhere he wants, whichever site he wants. Now, if the consumer chooses to come to my site, I don't see why I should pay. He has chosen, he's paid for the data. As simple as that. Sorry, one more thing. You see, and what we don't really want is to have the internet access like a remote of a set-top box on a cable TV company, okay, where you pay to get on, and then you only have 40 channels, or 20 channels, or 100 channels, and the rest can't get on, right? People have to be free to access what they want.
And just to add to what Sanjeev said on net neutrality, this is linked with a policy on access as well. And if you look at the global discussions on policy on access, which, as I said, haven't really taken off in a concrete way, then, for example, for India, we have to bridge at least 3 kinds of divides digitally. One is the rural-urban divide, which we started off with our telecom policy of 2 circles, if you remember, almost 20 years ago. But the issue on offsetting the urban and rural was to also provide for access, so that how do you subsidize access? The second divide is between genders, and this is based on empirical studies which have been done in collaboration with the United States and India on how digital technology bridges these gender divides. And at the end of this process of net neutrality is also the very important policy objective of empowerment. I mean, this morning we heard a lot about Digital India, but and the fact that it's people-centric. So if we do not sort of keep these policy objectives in mind and only go by what Sanjeev talked about, the limited access model, then we, in a sense, hurt our own overall policy on why we want to go down the digital route. So this is something that's important. But having said all that, We saw the shift in the United States on net neutrality. So how does that impact on us? Will be linked to the global infrastructure that we are all part of.
Rajan?
In terms of the inclusion of Huawei ZTE equipment, so first of all, I think in India, the debate is around inclusion of this in 5G, not in 4G, right? It's already there. So what we have said is that, first of all, for the first time in our networks, 5G standards purposefully incorporate security as part of the standard, all right? Previously, that was not the case in 2G, 3G, or 4G. So the standards, what we call 3GPP standards, specifically address issues of security, both on the network side, on the equipment side, on the application side, all the way down. So if we are concerned about this, we should make sure that we play in the standards and we make sure that the testing of the equipment is appropriate. And that's why the government is basically focused on saying what are the appropriate standards when the standards emerge in terms of the security standards that are embedded in 5G. How do we apply that for anybody equipment, be it Huawei, ZTE, Nokia, Ericsson, whatever. Operator concern is that if we, for whatever purpose, limit the OEMs, we are concerned in terms of, one, does the consumer get the best technology, and two, at the appropriate price? We're concerned about an oligopoly market emerging where you're at the whim and fancy of two operators, or two OEMs, not operators, two OEMs, right? And so we're saying is that there ought to be sufficient play in the marketplace. If the government has a concern, the government is well within its rights to establish appropriate testing protocols and be able to apply it across the board in a non-discriminatory fashion. So we believe that that's the approach that we as operators have taken in terms of this issue.
Thanks.
Just small. Do you think that security risk is higher in case of Chinese equipment?
We have seen nothing to date that indicates that equipment from China is any more risky or less risky than any other equipment that is presently embedded in our network.
Okay. Are there other questions? Because I really wanted to get, if I'm not putting you in a spot, Mr. Karnik, to comment. Because I mean, it's important to have your views. If you have a question or a comment, I would really like you to contribute and weigh in on this discussion. And of course, there are other questions as well. I'll come back to you. Mr. Karnik.
Thank you, Rajat. No, I came only to listen and get some wisdom. But I do have a question, and I've addressed it to Ambassador Mukerji. You rightly said, Ambassador Mukerji, that there's need for some convention globally on cyberspace. And my question to you, I know you're no longer in service, which is why you can answer more frankly, is why isn't India taking the lead more aggressively? Because a lot of countries around the world are looking at us, given the polarization which you rightly talked about. We were drivers sometimes to our loss in other conventions, right from the space days, which I recall for outer space treaties and so on. We were the drivers. In fact, we chaired many of the initial meetings. And the same with atomic energy, though we lost out in different ways, which I won't dwell on. So why is it that we seem to be a little hesitant? We are worried about our own self-interest, which will be best protected, I think, by taking a more aggressive stance on this. So are there things that you would suggest about what we might do, number one? Number two, just addition to that question, is it also time to look beyond the traditional UN format of intergovernmental and look at this in ways which have already started in this space, which is a multi-stakeholder approach, where you have not just government, but industry and civil society involved in this whole process? Just a question on that.
Thank you. There were other questions. So this is the last round, so I'm going to collect all the questions. And there are, I can see 5 hands up. Let's start at the back. Dipinder there.
Hi, I'm Anirudh Chingal, Senior Fellow at ICRIER. This is a question specifically addressed to Ambassador Mukerji. This is in light of the point you raised about India, the need for India to be a little more proactive. So, rules on e-commerce and digital trade are now being framed at the WTO in a group of 75 countries, which includes China. And India, of course, has agreed not to be a part of that group, which effectively means that we will end up being a rule taker again instead of being a rule maker. The arguments being offered in support of this stance is that, is the famous infant industry argument and the fact that we have a digital divide. Though the digital divide did not prevent demonetization, and 75 years of economic history has not supported any country having progress at the back of infant industry industrialization. So what are your views on that, and is it not time that we stop being a Mickey Mouse economy and started playing a more proactive role in things that really matter?
Thanks, Anirudh. May I request you, in the interest of time, to please be brief. Dipander, did you have a question? No. Okay, say. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Pranav. I'm a journalist. Mr. Mathews, one question.
Could you speak a little louder, please?
Hi, is it better? So, Mr. Mathews, one question. When you're talking about the evolution of telecom and the digital economy or even the data economy, how do you see, how do telecom operators see themselves monetizing data? Because that's something that they have in abundance. It's something I'd also point to Mr. Bikchandani from the other side of the table.
Yeah, there's a question here. Yes.
This is to Ambassador Mukerji. You spoke of a very interesting point, which was the physical infrastructure, like the one belt, one road, and we pitching for digital infrastructure, which is our strength. Now, what are the assumptions? I really like the idea, but what would be your assumptions when you made a kind of advocacy for this, when it comes to diplomacy doing something contrary?
Deepak, yeah. And I'll come back to you. One last question. So, Deepak, and then the last question.
Deepak Maheshwari. So, my question is again building on what Kiran just mentioned, and to Ambassador Mukerji, specifically around what President Macron did in mid-November in Paris. Three different things. Of course, the armistice, which happened on Sunday, the celebration of that, plus the Paris call, and of course, the hosting of the IGF. So, all these three. And I would say, France was, I'll say, more of an unlikely champion of this type of thing that suddenly emerged on the global space. And what's your reaction to, very specifically on France?
Okay. So, last question, gentleman. Yes, sir.
Sir, name is Mohan Bajikar. I have a very strange question. And the strange question is, these new technologies coming in take very long time for adoption in India. How can we reduce the time? Because by the time they get adopted, another new technology comes in. So how can we reduce that time?
Thank you. Since Ambassador Mukerji, a lot of the questions are directed to you and look at global and geopolitical leadership that India could play. May I pass over to you and then to Sanjeev and then Rajan?
I thought you'd ask me to attend another session or something. But still, I'm grateful. Dr. Kanik, I really appreciate your question because you and I have worked on this for some years now. And as you know, for a long time, there was a feeling of not resistance, but apprehension of any role that India should take, because a lot of the developments taking place in our digital economy were being driven by multinationals, especially based in the United States. So the apprehension was that it was not in the interests of these multinational companies for an intergovernmental or a global framework to be imposed on their activities. But the good news is that a lot of things have changed, especially in the past 2 years. And I was happy to see, for example, that even Microsoft, which put a proposal for a digital Geneva Convention, has now called for governments to take the lead in negotiating such a convention. Google has asked for an international framework for their data protection rights. They want the United States to upgrade theirs and then apply it globally. Siemens has come out with the Charter of Trust. So multinationals, therefore, are not the problem. I think multinationals are looking at governments to do something, to play a leadership role. I think that right now, because of the polarization that we see between essentially the United States and China, in the United Nations framework, it is right now an opportunity for India to take such a leadership role to start the discussion. We did something like this in 1996 on terrorism. I mean, it didn't go anywhere. It doesn't seem to have gone anywhere. But there is no reason not to take a leadership role. And I take your point, and I think that the point is that these negotiations or these discussions should not be limited to governments. They have to be multi-stakeholder. And the fact is that when we did the Tunis agenda, on the World Information Society, or when we did the negotiations on sustainable development, both these processes were multi-stakeholder. So India is very well aware of how that happened, and probably India needs to do more to get the other stakeholders from our own country onto the radar screen of these global discussions. And that's what I think this event in ICRIER will probably catalyze. And I think that's what I would like to say very briefly in response to what you mentioned. On the infant industry argument, yeah, I am one of those who think that we need to be proactive. And in terms of the digital economy, I think India actually has a tradition to fall back upon, which is that even at the closing stages of the Uruguay round, you remember, it was India and the European Union and the United States which took the lead to create the General Agreement on Trade and Services. These are the three countries which created the framework, which then got populated over these last 25 years with so many things that now the entire world seems to be dominated by services trade. But it was not so at the end of the Uruguay round. And so, therefore, I agree with you that we need to be proactive. And probably on electronic commerce, I have been among those voices which have argued that we need to be proactive long before this consultation paper came out. I mean, I'm very happy it's come out finally. On OBOR and the digital dimension, I was referring very specifically to a proposal being made by China for creating a digital Silk Road. This is in discussions they have had in St. Petersburg with the Russians. The Russians, in fact, have tried to put this into what they call the common Eurasian space. My only reaction to all this was that if we look at it in terms of an opportunity, then instead of our trying to spend so much diplomatic capital in getting connectivity projects and then having these projects under the sword of Damocles of unilateral sanctions, maybe this is a better option for somebody else to build these infrastructure and for us to use the infrastructure. And that's why I said, like the Silk Road existed, but we are the ones who populated the Silk Road with our finances, with our ideas and our culture. So I think that, and the products. So that's what I'd like to say.
Sanjeev?
Okay, data monetization. You're selling data, charge a price, right? As simple as that. You cannot have a situation where, you know, आप बिजली की कंपनी हो, आप कंज्यूमर को बोलें, देखिए, you know, बिजली का ये प्राइस है, लेकिन I will go to, आप AC कौन सा चला रहे हैं? Amtrex नहीं चलेगा, because Amtrex has not paid us, right? LG चल जाएगा, LG has paid us. And carrier, you know, you're making too much profit, so I want to charge a different price from you.